They say every family has secrets, but some secrets are too heavy, too twisted for anyone outside the walls of a home to ever imagine. For decades, one American family lived under a shadow so dark, so deeply hidden, that even neighbors who passed by their weathered farmhouse didn't suspect the torment that festered within. Children laughed outside in the sun. The adults wore polite smiles. But behind the closed doors, the walls absorbed whispers of fear, of suffering, of a history no one wanted to touch. This family, like so many others, was ignored by a world eager to look away. And yet the echoes of their horror never truly disappeared. They waited, patient, insidious, until someone finally looked closer, and America could no longer ignore what had been buried in plain sight. And it begins in a town that feels ordinary on first glance. The kind of place where every street corner holds a diner, a church, a high school football field. A town so normal that the darkest things could hide in the open. The house at the edge of town belonged to the Millers. They had been here for generations, their name etched on tombstones in the local cemetery, their presence woven into the history of the land. Outsiders might have called them quiet, private. But those who lived under their roof, or even just brushed against the edges of their lives, felt something unnameable, a subtle unease that lingered like smoke after a fire. And what made this family different wasn't simply misfortune or eccentricity. It was the kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself with noise. It grows quietly. It festers in the small, almost imperceptible ways: a child afraid of their own reflection, a woman who never leaves the kitchen, a man who disappears for hours, returning with eyes hollowed by something unspoken. The horror didn't come from outsiders. It came from the very people who were supposed to protect one another. It came from rituals that were whispered about in town, but dismissed, from patterns that neighbors pretended not to notice, from a silence so complete it became its own kind of violence. And no one wrote about them in the newspapers. No headlines warned the town. The Millers were invisible in the history books, as though the story they carried was too heavy, too shameful, for anyone to record. And yet, every family has a footprint, every scream leaves a mark, every secret, no matter how carefully buried, eventually bleeds through the cracks. The Millers' story began to resurface decades later, pieced together from old letters, hastily filed police reports, and the fragmented recollections of the few brave enough to speak. What emerges is not just a tale of personal tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the parts of American history we prefer to ignore, the undercurrent of violence and neglect that can flourish behind closed doors when no one is looking. And this is not a story of monsters in the woods, nor of strangers breaking into homes. This is a story of what happens when the familiar, the family you trust, the people you call your own, becomes the source of terror. It is a story that challenges the idea of safety, of normalcy, of the quiet lives we assume are free from darkness. Because sometimes the most horrifying things are not hidden in the shadows. They live in the daylight, they laugh with the children, they shake hands with neighbors, and they wait. And now, as we peel back the layers of this family's history, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth: America ignored them. Generations of suffering were dismissed, trivialized, or explained away. The quiet horror they endured became invisible, not because it didn't exist, but because no one wanted to see it. Today, we will not look away. Today, we will step inside the Miller story, into the corridors of fear and trauma, and examine a darkness that, until now, was carefully concealed. And the first fragments of their story are almost too ordinary to seem real. A house, a family, a town that believes in decency and order. But beneath the veneer of normalcy lies something far more insidious, a pattern of secrecy, control, and unimaginable suffering. And as we begin to trace it, you may notice something unsettling about your own sense of safety, about the walls of your own home, about the stories families hide when no one is watching. And the Millers' home had stood at the edge of town for nearly a century, a silent witness to generations of life and death. Its paint was faded, wood-warped, but it carried the pride of ownership, the kind that only comes from a family that has survived countless winters and storms. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. A porch with a creaking swing, curtains drawn against the sun, a yard where the grass grew uneven, half wild. And yet, for those who lived within, it was a cage. Every corner, every room, held a memory of pain. The floorboards whispered in the night, the ceiling seemed to press down on those who tried to sleep, and the air smelled faintly of something old, something lingering from decades past. And the first signs of trouble weren't obvious to the casual observer. There were no police sirens in the night, no shouting matches in the front yard. The Millers were quiet, almost painfully polite when seen by neighbors, but the subtleties betrayed the rot beneath. A child always flinching when touched, a mother who avoided eye contact for days on end, a father whose presence could make a room feel colder. Friends and family would come and go, and no one would dare ask too many questions. It was as if everyone instinctively knew that asking would break something delicate, or worse, release a truth they were not prepared to witness, and the roots of the Miller's horror can be traced back decades to patterns that repeated across generations. It began with control, subtle at first, the way a parent might insist on perfection or silence, using love as a weapon. Punishments were not always visible. They were psychological, methodical. Children learned quickly mistakes could mean weeks of isolation, nights spent awake under the weight of fear, whispers of threats that seemed to hang in the air long after the words were spoken. And then there were the rituals, small, obscure, almost ritualistic behaviors that the family enforced upon one another, rules that outsiders would never recognize but that shaped every moment of life inside the house. And one of the most haunting aspects of the Millers' story is how ordinary it all seemed. Neighbors never called the authorities. Teachers never noticed the bruises that weren't easily explained. The family functioned, in public like any other. Children went to school, adults went to work. They laughed in the town square and attended church functions. And yet, the façade was carefully constructed, masking a reality that was darker than any outsider could imagine. Trauma became tradition, a family inheritance passed down not in stories or possessions, but in fear and compliance. And the depth of suffering becomes more chilling when you understand the isolation. The Millers were self-contained. Friends were discouraged, letters and visits monitored, and the outside world became a distant, almost mythical place. Children learned to hide their fear in the creases of their smiles, to nod when spoken to fold themselves small so no one would notice the trembling beneath. By the time someone from outside finally pieced together the puzzle decades later, the house was already a repository of long-buried secrets, a monument to generations of psychological terror. And yet, there were glimpses, fleeting, almost imperceptible, of rebellion. A door left unlocked, a note scribbled in the margins of a homework assignment, a glance exchanged between siblings that said more than words ever could. These small acts of defiance were dangerous. The Millers, particularly the patriarch, were quick to punish anything that threatened their control. But these moments hint at something crucial even in the darkest houses, even in the most meticulously enforced cycles of fear. The human spirit finds cracks, small openings where hope can seep through. And it is here, in the quiet and often invisible world of everyday life, that the Millers' story becomes almost impossible to comprehend. The horror wasn't loud. It didn't require dramatic acts to scar those who lived it. It was the insidious, almost imperceptible weight of fear, the kind that bends a child's body, that makes a parent's smile tremble, that leaves adults questioning the very foundation of what love and family should feel like. This is the darkness that America ignored for decades, hidden in plain sight, in a house that looked ordinary, in a family that appeared functional. And the first clear evidence that something was terribly wrong with the Millers didn't come from a neighbor, a teacher, or even a distant relative. It came from a voice long ignored, the voice of one of the children. Not out loud, not in public, but in small, desperate ways that hinted at a reality no one was ready to face. Letters hidden under mattresses, journal entries filled with trembling handwriting, recounting incidents so disturbing that anyone reading them later would struggle to believe they were real. These pages spoke of nights spent awake listening to arguments, of punishments that left both body and spirit broken, of secrets too grotesque to share with the world. And yet, when they were discovered, the response was muted, carefully controlled. Children exaggerate, people would say. Families have disagreements. The words were safe, convenient, and cruelly dismissive, and as the child grew, so did the courage to resist. But resistance was not simple. Every act of defiance was met with calculated retaliation, a system of fear that ensured survival required silence. Friends were forbidden, schoolwork was monitored, and the most ordinary interactions outside the home became exercises in self-preservation. It is impossible to overstate the mental toll of living this way. The child learned early that the very people who should have been protectors were the source of terror. Trust was a foreign concept, and the home, a place that should have offered safety, was instead a landscape of psychological traps, each corner hiding another lesson in obedience and fear. And some of the methods the Millers used to enforce control were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Emotional manipulation, shaming, isolation. A brother forbidden to speak unless spoken to. A sister forced to stand still for hours to demonstrate obedience. Punishments escalated not randomly, but methodically, as if a hidden rule book dictated each reaction. It was not chaos, it was order, meticulously designed to break spirits and normalize terror as part of everyday life. And within this system, the family perpetuated itself, unaware or unwilling to confront the generational trauma it was creating. And yet there were moments, fleeting and rare, when the veil slipped. A neighbor might glimpse bruises, or a child with a distant, haunted expression. Teachers might notice withdrawn behavior, unusual patterns of speech, and yet almost always these signs were ignored, rationalized, or dismissed. America, it seemed, had other priorities. The suffering of one family could be overlooked as long as the façade of normalcy remained intact. In these small moments of inattention, the horror continued uninterrupted, allowed to thrive because no one demanded to see it. And the most haunting aspect of the Miller's story is not simply the abuse itself, but the system of complicity surrounding it. Extended relatives, neighbors, and even local officials, whether through fear, disbelief, or simple disinterest, enabled the family's darkness to flourish. It was a network of silence, one that ensured the home remained a place of unspoken terror. Even when rumors surfaced, they were brushed aside. After all, who wanted to uncover what might lie behind a closed door, especially when that truth was so profoundly unsettling? The house became a monument to collective denial, a microcosm of a society willing to look away rather than confront what it could not comprehend. And within this silence, the family's inner life continued to unravel. Siblings learned to navigate fear with cunning, to whisper to one another in secret, to create codes that allowed them to survive. Parents, trapped in the same system of cruelty, either perpetuated it unconsciously or were victims themselves in a cycle they had never escaped. Trauma became invisible inheritance, passed down as if it were tradition, and each generation suffered, yet nobody outside the house seemed capable of stopping it. And this story challenges everything we assume about horror. It is not a single moment of violence or a shocking headline. It is the slow, grinding erosion of the soul, the quiet manipulation of love into fear, the hidden horrors that leave marks not on the skin, but on memory, trust, and identity. This is the darkness that lingered in the Miller's home for decades, hidden from view, dismissed by a town, and ignored by a country. It waited patiently, knowing that the world preferred ignorance to truth, until finally, someone dared to confront it. And as the years passed, the Miller's horrors became more intricate, almost ritualistic in the way they were maintained. There were patterns that outsiders could not have recognized unless they spent weeks, months, even years piecing together the fragments of memory left behind by those who survived. Every family has rules, but the Miller's rules were designed to strip away identity. Children were taught to monitor one another, siblings trained to report transgressions, and obedience was measured in the smallest details: the angle of a chair, the placement of a plate, the timbre of a voice. Deviance, however minor, was punished, leaving the household in a state of perpetual tension, a quiet terror that settled over the walls like smoke. And some of the cruelties were overt, others invisible. A child might be denied sleep for hours, forced to stand in a corner until exhaustion blurred the line between pain and hallucination. Meals became tools of control, withheld or granted based on compliance. Praise was weaponized, given only to manipulate. And yet, perhaps the most insidious horrors were those that could not be seen: whispered threats, the constant suggestion that love itself was conditional, that safety depended entirely on submission. This was psychological imprisonment at its most meticulous, and it left wounds that would take decades to fully map. And neighbors and townspeople often noticed strange behavior, but they never knew how to intervene. Children avoided contact, adults were polite but distant, and the house radiated an aura that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Friends and distant relatives whispered about the oddness of the Millers, but speculation never became action. The cycle of abuse was protected not just by the family itself, but by the collective blindness of a community unwilling to confront the darkness in their midst. Silence became a shield not for safety, but for the preservation of horror. And one particularly chilling aspect of the Miller's story is how self-perpetuating the trauma became. The children internalized the patterns of fear and control, unconsciously replicating the behaviors inflicted upon them. As they aged, they became both victims and enforcers, caught in a loop that erased distinctions between cruelty and care. It is a psychological trap so effective that even those who later left the home carried the imprint of it into adulthood. Trust, intimacy, and personal boundaries were all compromised, leaving scars invisible to the eye, but impossible to ignore for the mind and soul. And documentation of the Miller's suffering is fragmented, yet enough remains to outline the scale of the horror. Letters tucked into drawers, a diary discovered decades later, and brief, cryptic references in local police logs reveal the extent of the dysfunction. And the most striking detail is not just what was done, but how long it went unnoticed. For generations, the Miller's story existed in plain sight, hidden behind polite conversation, respectable appearances, and a town's unwillingness to pry. It is a cautionary tale of how ordinary life can conceal extraordinary trauma, and how systems of neglect can amplify the cruelty within a single household. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearable, the realization that the Millers were not alone in their suffering. Countless families across the country exist under similar shadows, their pain ignored, rationalized, or forgotten. The Miller's home is not unique, it is extreme, yes, but it is also a mirror of the many invisible horrors quietly unfolding behind closed doors, tolerated by a society that values appearances over truth. Understanding this forces us to question not just the family itself, but the culture that allowed it to persist. And yet, even in the depths of despair, there were sparks of defiance, moments when those trapped inside tried to reclaim their lives. Secret alliances between siblings, whispered confidences, and small acts of rebellion created fragile lifelines. The Miller's story is not simply one of horror, but of survival against overwhelming odds. It reminds us that even in the darkest of places, the human spirit searches for escape, for connection, for hope. And when the outside world finally confronted the truth, it was not the terror that shocked most, it was the endurance, the resilience, the stories of those who refused to be erased. And by the time the outside world began to piece together the Miller's story, decades of horror had already taken root. It wasn't a single event that exposed them. It was the accumulation of small, overlooked signs, fragments that finally formed a picture too disturbing to ignore. Law enforcement reports buried in county archives, medical notes hinting at unexplained injuries, and eyewitness accounts from neighbors who remembered things they had pushed out of their minds, all combined into a mosaic of terror. And yet, even then, it took persistence and courage to uncover the full truth. America had ignored this family for so long that acknowledging their suffering felt almost forbidden, as if admitting it existed would shatter a collective illusion of safety, and the revelations were brutal. The extent of control, manipulation, and abuse was staggering. Children had been subjected to forms of psychological terror most people cannot imagine, trained to suppress their fear and obedience to a system that rewarded cruelty. Parents who might have been sympathetic were themselves trapped, often repeating patterns learned from previous generations. The Miller's legacy became a textbook example of trauma passed down like inheritance, each generation shaping and reshaping the next in ways both subtle and devastating. And it is impossible to fully grasp the mental landscape of someone growing up in that house. Imagine walking into a room and sensing danger in every corner, not because anyone is overtly threatening you, but because the air itself carries the weight of expectation and fear. Every word, every glance, every action was scrutinized. Spontaneity was punished. Happiness was conditional. Normal childhood milestones, friends, school, play were tainted by an invisible, omnipresent authority. And by the time outsiders finally pieced together the fragments of this family's story, the psychological damage had been layered over decades, creating scars that no apology or intervention could completely erase. And yet amid the horror, there are glimpses of humanity that make the story even more unsettling. Siblings protected one another in subtle ways, sharing small acts of defiance, whispering secrets, and preserving tiny pieces of joy that the family's patriarch tried to erase. These moments were fleeting but essential, proof that even under extreme oppression, the will to survive can persist. And it is precisely this juxtaposition, unspeakable cruelty alongside fragile courage, that haunts the mind long after reading the accounts. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? It's a question without a simple answer. The Miller's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, fear, and the cost of silence. How much are we willing to endure in the name of family? At what point does protection cross into complicity? And most chilling of all, how many other families in America live with horrors just as profound, unnoticed, unrecorded, and unacknowledged? And what makes this case particularly haunting is the slow, deliberate way in which the trauma was inflicted and maintained. This wasn't a sudden outbreak of violence, it was a methodical, generational system designed to break spirits and normalize fear. Children internalized the lessons they were taught. Adults carried patterns of abuse learned in their own childhoods. And for decades, a society that claimed to value innocence and safety looked away, preferring polite ignorance to confrontation. The Millers were invisible until someone finally insisted on seeing them. And in examining the Millers, we are forced to confront the mechanics of horror on a domestic scale. We realize that terror does not always roar. It can whisper, it can hide behind smiles, and it can thrive in plain sight. And the most unsettling part is that the people who could have intervened often didn't. Neighbors, teachers, relatives, even local officials, most were aware in some sense that something was wrong, and yet almost no one acted decisively. In this way, the Miller's story is not only about a single family, it is about a collective failure, a moral blind spot that allowed horror to grow unchecked for generations. And the Miller's story is also a story of memory, how it warps, hides, and sometimes betrays. For those who survived, recollections of life inside the house are fragmented, uneven, and often contradictory. One sibling remembers nights spent locked in a closet, counting the hours until a parent returned. Another recalls quiet dinners where even laughter was measured, where any hint of joy could trigger suspicion or punishment. Over time, these memories became tools of survival, coded narratives meant to protect the self from the full weight of trauma. And yet, when examined collectively, they paint a picture of horror so persistent and precise it becomes almost mechanical in its cruelty. And perhaps the most disturbing element is how ordinary the Millers' world appeared to the outside. Their home, their yard, their behaviors, nothing would have stood out to a casual observer. Children went to school, parents attended church, holidays were celebrated with the expected rituals. And yet beneath that surface, the psychological terror was constant. The ordinary became a mask, a camouflage that allowed horror to grow in silence. It is this contrast, the appearance of normalcy overlaying unimaginable suffering, that makes the Millers' story so difficult to forget. It forces us to question not only what happens behind closed doors, but how much of our perception of normal life is shaped by what we choose to ignore. And even more haunting is the way the cycle of trauma continued once family members left the home. Those who escaped carried the weight of their experiences, struggling with trust, relationships, and a sense of self. The psychological imprint of the Millers' control did not vanish with the physical distance from the house. It followed them into adulthood, into new families, into careers, shaping their lives in ways that were invisible to most, yet undeniable to them. Generational trauma, in this sense, is not a metaphor. It is a tangible force, as real as any injury, as persistent as any memory, and in the family itself, the Millers remained largely unrepentant, even when confronted. Their patterns were ingrained, their perception of normalcy warped by decades of fear and control. They did not recognize their actions as cruelty in the way an outsider would. To them, it was life, it was tradition, it was survival. This is what makes the story so terrifying. Evil need not be dramatic or monstrous. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, unrecognized, and deeply human. The Millers were not outsiders to the story of American horror. They were us, reflected in the darkest corners of family life, in the moments we would rather not examine. And it is here, too, that we see the moral complexity of the narrative. While the Millers inflicted suffering, the survivors demonstrate courage, resilience, and ingenuity. They learn to navigate a landscape designed to break them, finding ways to communicate, protect one another, and eventually escape. Yet their victories are bittersweet, marked by the lifelong scars of the home they endured. There is no cinematic resolution, no clean ending, only the lingering echo of trauma, a reminder that some horrors do not vanish, even when the immediate threat is gone. And the Millers' tale forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How long can terror persist in plain sight before it is acknowledged? How many families hide similar horrors, protected by silence, denial, or fear? And how does a society reconcile with the knowledge that ignoring trauma enables it to grow? Their story is a warning as much as it is a chronicle, a reminder that horror often exists not in shadows or in strangers, but in the very spaces we trust most, in the people we call family. And the story of the Millers does not end with exposure or justice. In many ways, it never truly ends. The family legacy, steeped in fear and control, leaves its imprint far beyond the walls of the farmhouse. Survivors carry the memories, the lessons, the silent warnings of what happens when abuse is ignored. And for those who never speak, the house itself becomes a tomb of untold stories, a monument to the suffering that America refused to see. And what is perhaps most haunting is the knowledge that the Millers were not unique. Their house, their traditions, their cycles of cruelty are mirrored in countless homes across the country, hidden beneath tidy lawns and polite conversation. For every story that surfaces, there are countless others lost to time, forgotten or actively suppressed. The Millers are a warning, a lens through which we can examine the invisible horrors that exist within families, communities, and institutions that refuse to intervene. They reveal the fragility of safety and the danger of silence, showing us that ignoring trauma does not make it disappear. It allows it to grow, to metastasize, until it reaches a scale unimaginable to those who have not witnessed it firsthand. And yet, amid the darkness, there is a glimmer of light. The survivors who came forward, who pieced together the truth from fragments, demonstrate a kind of courage that is almost impossible to quantify. They teach us that confronting horror, even when it is deeply personal and decades old, is possible. They remind us that stories buried beneath shame and fear can, if acknowledged, create a path toward understanding and healing. The Millers' horror, while undeniable, also becomes a testament to resilience. It is proof that even in the most oppressive environments, survival is possible, and sometimes that survival carries with it the power to expose truths that society would rather ignore. And as we reflect on this story, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what was lost and the shadow of what could have been prevented. It challenges our assumptions about family, about safety, about the ways in which communities and institutions respond to trauma. The Millers did not exist in isolation. Their suffering was tolerated, in small ways and large, by everyone who looked away. And that is perhaps the most enduring horror of all, not simply what happened within the walls of their home, but the complicity of a society that refused to see. And history is filled with the names of those we celebrate, the events we memorialize, and the narratives we choose to preserve. But some histories are hidden, buried beneath silence, shame, or denial. The Millers' story is one of those histories. It demands attention not because it is sensational, but because it is real. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that horror is not always exotic, not always obvious. It is sometimes ordinary, quiet, and devastatingly close to home. And when it is ignored for long enough, it does not vanish. It waits, patient and unforgiving, until someone finally listens, and in the end, America ignored the Millers for far too long. But their story is no longer invisible. The house, the letters, the memories, the trauma, they all serve as reminders of what happens when we look away. And perhaps, by confronting their history, by examining the dark truths they endured, we can learn something about vigilance, about empathy, and about the courage required to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The Millers' legacy is not simply a tale of horror. It is a lesson, a warning, and an invitation to never turn a blind eye again. And because sometimes the scariest stories are not about what lurks in the shadows, but about what we fail to see in the light.